Oh, you know what? I heard stories like what happened to you. Like this crazy creepy cat who like walks through walls and stuff. Like a ghost.
Like Baba Yaga. Baba Yaga, the witch.
Myths and legends change across cultures and over time, but some things are a universal constant. Every culture has a creation story. Nearly every religion has an apocalypse tale. Every society questions what happens after death. And everyone has heard stories about the things that go bump in the night.
Like Baba Yaga.
Whether they start as stories meant to frighten children into obedience, or spooky legends meant to encourage thrill-seekers, or attract meddling kids and their dumb dog, these particular types of villains have one thing in common. They know what you're afraid of, and they'll use it against you. Especially if they are the thing that you're afraid of. The Boogeyman.
Well, I know it's absurd, but I dreamed the Boogeyman was after me, and he's
Boogeyman! You nailed the window shut! I'll get the gun!
I'm Danger Dangers, and this is Evil-ution. Spoilers ahead for the following. Boogeymen are a type of creature or monster that are inextricably linked to our fears. The term boogeyman is thought to be derived from the Middle English root bog or boog, which in modern English roughly translates to terror or fear-inspiring. The term may also have evolved from the early English folklore about the boog bear or bugbear, which was a type of demon that would take the form of a bear-like creature and devour small children, likely where these roots got their association with malevolence and evil. So, knowing that, if we were to break down the word boogeyman into its roots, it roughly has one of two literal meanings: he who inspires fear and he who is fear, both of which function as different subtypes of the boogeyman mythos. We'll get into the difference between those in a moment, but first, let's take a look back at some of the folklore they come from.
Jeez, Rick! Whoa, this isn't good!
Nothing but fear from here on out, bitch!
Apologies in advance when I butcher these pronunciations. Most of these I've only ever seen written down and not said aloud, so I'm bound to get a few of these wrong. In no particular order, here are a few notable boogeyman legends. The Boogeyman of Mexico is known as the Cucuy, also referred to as El Coco or El Cuco in other Spanish-speaking countries. The Cucuy is the beast beneath your bed.
In your closet, in your head!
The Cucuy is likely the root of a lot of our cultural touchstones regarding monsters hiding in the dark crevices of our rooms. The Cucuy is a monster that preys on children, specifically those that do not go to sleep when their parents tell them to. Depending on what part of the world you're in, it's either a hairy coconut-faced demon, which, fun fact, is where coconuts actually get their name from, their resemblance to the vacant stare and hairy face of El Coco, or a goblin-type creature with razor-sharp teeth and glowing red eyes.
Come on in here.
Bulgaria and many Eastern European countries have the sack man, a large man who, guess what, carries around a large burlap sack. When naughty children wander off alone at night without supervision, the sack man will snatch them up, stuff them into his bag, and take them away. The sack man, or bag man, is a very common myth in Eastern Europe, Latin American countries, and in some areas of Asia, and has more than a few similarities with his Christmas reskin. Many Germanic countries have a winter-specific variant of the Bagman, the Krampus. While Santa Claus rewards children with presents for being good, his evil counterpart, Krampus, punishes them, either by devouring them, kidnapping them, or beating them with a stick, or sometimes all three. Iceland has a female counterpart to Krampus, since they do not actually have a Santa Claus figure in their winter traditions. That role is instead filled by the Yule Lads, mischievous imps that each reward a very specific kind of good behavior with festive gifts. Their evil counterpart is their mother, Grilla, a troll woman who would emerge on Christmas Eve to hunt down and devour misbehaving children. The legends say that she's been dead for some time, and the threat is probably past, but her ghost might still continue to linger, so you can never truly be sure, and should continue to be good just in case.
Oh, scary! Oh, shiver my timbers! Shut up, man!
Many Mediterranean countries have legends of a creature known as the Babao, a boogeyman that takes the form of a tall, wandering man in a black cloak who comes knocking at your door around dinner time to take away any children that don't eat their soup, which I think is hilariously specific. Continuing down the tracks of the punishing naughty children train, Russian folklore has the witch Baba Yaga. She kidnaps naughty children and takes them to her wandering house in the woods, which never stays in the same place, so the children will be inevitably lost forever. Oh yeah, and she probably eats them too. That's about par for the course with these.
Baba Yaga, come at night, little children sleepy tight.
You probably get the picture by now about the varieties that harm naughty children, but it is worth noting that there are a few that don't follow that trend. A rare benevolent example of a boogeyman can be found in the Indonesian ghost known as Wiwi Gambol. Wiwi Gambol kidnaps children in order to rescue them from abusive families, stealing them away in the night and protecting them until their parents or guardians can prove that they've learned the error of their ways and will parent their children more appropriately and responsibly. Another boogeyman meant specifically to frighten adults is the United States boogeyman known as the Jersey Devil. The Jersey Devil is a monstrous creature with a horse head, bat wings, serpent's tail, and cloven hooves that is said to have been the demonic offspring of a cursed pregnancy. Legend has it that the Jersey Devil was the 13th child of suspected witch Jane Leeds, who, in her labor pains, put a curse on her devil of an offspring. She delivered her child during a thunderstorm, and the baby then morphed into a horrific monster. The monster took to the streets of southern New Jersey and has occasionally been seen skulking around in the night over the centuries since. Fun fact, while the Jersey Devil is considered to be a cryptid, since there's no definitive proof that it doesn't exist, it is generally believed to have been definitively debunked as the product of what can only be described as a real-world Scooby-Doo villain plot. Experts believe that it was invented by real estate agents in order to scare the locals into leaving and selling their property for super cheap so that they could flip it for a huge profit.
And I would have made millions if it hadn't been for you meddling kids.
While most of these folkloric legends are generally quite similar in their intent across cultures, the variations between them have given rise to roughly 3 different subcategories of boogeyman: the monster in the shadows, the fear eater, and the nightmare weaver. Since the boogeyman is primarily a creature of the imagination, there's usually a ton of overlap between these, but let's look at each on their own merits. Beginning with the monster from the shadows, one of the earliest examples that came to define this type was the demon Grendel from the epic poem Beowulf. Said to be a descendant of the biblical Cain, he is a creature repulsed by the loud noises of merriment in the villages nearby, and is drawn in periodically to slaughter them in order to stop the noise. He is described in various translations of the poem as being a shadow walker, cloaked in a shroud of darkness, though he's given no consistent appearance. He initially started off as a much more malevolent presence in earlier versions of the poem, developing a taste for blood and taking sadistic pleasure in tormenting the villagers. Many more modern translations of the epic, however, have painted him in a much more sympathetic light as a tortured creature with no ill intent who is merely driven to desperate measures in order to stop the pain it suffers as a result of the loud noise. Another, much more clickbaity example of the shadow monster that is way less morally ambiguous and overtly evil can be found in Mike Myers.
Yeah, baby, yeah!
And also Michael Myers from John Carpenter's Halloween. Though he is far less supernatural than many of the other examples we'll touch upon, he is very directly referred to as the Boogeyman by multiple characters in several of the movies. Now, since there are 12 movies in this franchise at the time of this recording, soon to be 13, multiple novelizations, and it has been rebooted twice, the mythos of Michael Myers is a bit inconsistent to say the least. But generally, what does stay the same are his depiction as a mute and slow-moving but methodical killer, with superhuman strength and durability who is able to consistently recover from extremely lethal injuries. The stories give a few differing explanations for why this is, one of them being the shenanigans of a deranged cult that are imbuing him with superhuman abilities and forcing him to reenact the ritual killings of his family members on Halloween in order to appease the spirit of Samhain. Another explanation is that he is either partially possessed or psychically linked to the ghost of a druid priestess who is forced to walk the earth forever reliving the brutal murder she committed. Whatever the reason, he is able to move surprisingly stealthily between the shadows, and though he never moves faster than a slow walk, he is able to appear and disappear at astonishing speeds, lurking in the shadows, ready to kill at a moment's notice. Another example that takes the Monster in the Shadows moniker to extremely literal ends can be found in David Tennant's run on Doctor Who.
That's not darkness down those tunnels. This is not a shadow. It's a swarm. A man-eating swarm. The piranhas of the air. The Vashta Nerada.
The Vashta Nerada are a swarm of carnivorous microscopic parasites that can only survive in the darkness and travel through the shadows. There is no way to defend against them other to simply avoid them entirely. He describes them as existing on nearly every planet in the cosmos, lurking in the darkness in very small, mostly docile clusters that occasionally cause people or animals to go missing. They are the reason why all creatures have an instinctive fear of the dark. A few more lighthearted takes on this boogeyman subtype can be found in The Nightmare Before Christmas, where a vast majority of the residents in Halloween Town are inspired by various famous monsters and boogeymen.
I am the one hiding under your stairs, fingers like snakes and spiders in my hair.
I am the clown with the tearaway face!
Here in a flash and Donovan.
But all of them are ultimately harmless, except one.
I am the shadow on the moon at night, filling your dreams to the brim with fright.
While the other characters and creatures seek only to scare and have no actual ill intent, Oogie Boogie is willing to harm, traumatize, and kill for his own amusement. Even his character design is meant to be more sinister than any of the other monsters around him. Which, granted, it's still more whimsical than it is scary because it is Tim Burton after all, but still, he is a burlap sack that is overflowing with the things people fear, which, in the case of the movie, is mostly just insects and snakes, but the possibilities are endless. Another ultimately harmless boogeyman is shown in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban.
Would anyone like to venture a guess as to what is inside?
That's a boggart, that is.
Very good, Mr. Thomas.
The boggart is a shape-shifting creature that takes the form of the worst fear of whoever is currently looking at it. What's important to note with this one is that it spells out in very simple terms a clear and distinct weakness that most versions of the second type of boogeyman has, in that facing and making light of your fears renders it completely powerless.
Today, I'm going to teach you how to face your fears. Now, the first step to facing your fears is...
Moving on to the second type of boogeyman, it is what I call the Fear Eater. These are a type of creature that, well, obviously feed on your fears. These type tend to be by far the most powerful boogeymen, but they usually operate on very specific rule sets with exploitable weaknesses. Let's begin by looking at the one that most rides the line between Shadow Monster and Fear Eater, sort of bridging the gap between the two. The Creeper from Jeepers Creepers. The Creeper awakens every 23 years to take part in a savage killing spree in order to fuel its longevity. The Creeper consumes and assimilates its victims, stealing specific organs from each one in order to replace its own injured or deteriorated ones. And it specifically targets the victims that fear it the most, since its powers and abilities to assimilate grow in proportion to the fear of its victims. Though fear makes it more powerful, the Creeper does not have the same weakness to courage that other Fear Eaters suffer from, though this does come at the expense of being generally far more easy to destroy and overall more vulnerable. A much more iconic take on this type of monster, which many others were ripped off from inspired by, comes from the world of Stephen King. King is pretty notorious in general for stories about dark entities that prey on negative emotions, but none are perhaps more famous or more definitive than It. Although the creature from It prefers to take the form of Pennywise the Dancing Clown, It can take the shape of just about anything, and will tend to shapeshift into whatever form its victims find most terrifying. Every 27 years, it emerges into the town of Derry, Maine, and seeks out victims that it can first traumatize, then devour. It primarily targets children, especially those with latent psychic abilities, children who shine, the way that Danny Torrance and Dick Halloran from The Shining do, though usually not to the same, almost superheroic level. He targets this type of victim specifically because they give him more potent energy to feed on, and because their fears tend to be less abstract than the fears of adults, making them overall easier to manipulate. It is a cosmic entity that is astonishingly powerful, with the abilities of shapeshifting, mind control, reality warping, and the power to just outright turn off people's ability to notice it. But it does have a weakness. Though this is a pretty drastic oversimplification, it, like the Boggarts from Harry Potter, can be defeated by overcoming your fears and taking away the power they, and by extension it, has over you. Though unlike Harry Potter, this is part of a very complicated cult ritual that involves a giant space turtle and, a middle school orgy. Not exactly the kind of creepy I want from a creepy story, so I'll stick to the Tim Curry one.
If you see...
Excuse me, sir. Do you have Prince Albert in a can? You do? Well, you better let the poor guy out.
Help, Mike Hanlon. That I had to go. That I had to get cleaned up. Helen!
Arguably the most iconic of the Fear Eaters is Freddy Krueger from the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. After making a devil's bargain on his deathbed, the serial killer known as the Springwood Slasher would go on to have a sort of conditional immortality, able to live forever in dreams with near limitless power, so long as people continue to remember and fear him in the real world. Freddy is literally the stuff of nightmares, and is a blend of the Fear Eater and the next type of boogeyman, the Nightmare Weaver. He continuously and methodically targets the children and teenagers of Elm Street in brutal murder sprees, both for his own amusement and to keep his legend going. He is usually undone by being dragged out of the dream world and into reality, where his godlike powers disappear completely and he is left completely vulnerable as he becomes functionally a normal human being again. But given enough time to recover, he can continue to come back in the dream world so long as his memory continues to persist. Subversions of this type of boogeyman tend to be mostly played for comedy, with characters like Boogie from The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, who is a fear-fueled monster that absolutely nobody is afraid of. Hell, after a quest for supreme fear-fueled power backfires on him, he himself becomes afraid of everything. The monsters from Monsters, Inc. are also a subversion of this. Though they do depend on fear and are undone by laughter, it's only tangentially, since they use fear as a power source, and laughter just proves to be a far more powerful source of renewable energy that renders screams obsolete. The one major subversion of this trope that is not played for comedy is the Babadook, which takes most of the basic fear-eating boogeyman formula, but has the crucial difference of replacing the emotion of fear with grief. The Babadook possesses the mother of a family in deep mourning and draws its power from their despair. Ultimately, confronting their repressed grief is the only way they are able to overcome the Babadook's influence, rendering it manageable and able to be detained, but never defeated, as it can never fully or truly be gotten rid of. The final subtype of boogeyman is perhaps the most straightforward, the Nightmare Weaver. This is a character that specifically instills fear in others in order to debilitate or control them, often through their dreams. This type of boogeyman includes any of the over 200 plus versions of the Sandman to show up in horror movies, TV shows, comic books, and more as an antagonist. Look, see, it just keeps going and going, on and on and on. Other notable Nightmare Weavers include Doctor Strange's Fear Lords, the most prominent among them literally being named Nightmare. He is the ruler of the dream dimension who is responsible for creating, guess what? Nightmares. But easily the most famous of the Nightmare Weavers would have to be Batman's The Scarecrow, who uses chemicals and hallucinogens in order to hijack the fear centers of the brain and instill pure terror on his victims. Never one to pass up the chance to underdo themselves, DC Comics has its slew of discount scarecrows too, including early versions of Professor Hugo Strange, who used to fill pretty much the same role as Scarecrow, just far less effectively, and the Sandman's Dr. Destiny. This extremely unsettling man uses the power of Morpheus's Dreamstone in order to puppeteer his victims by hijacking their daydreams so that he can forcibly keep them in a hypnotic trance and lord over them as an all-powerful cult leader. Morpheus himself actually qualifies for this subcategory too, just as the rare heroic version of the Nightmare Weaver. He initially starts off as more of just a passive force of nature, the Dream Lord, who generates the world of dreams that people go into when they sleep. He is able to move freely between them as well as manipulate them, and, over time, his exposure to humanity encourages him to use his abilities more judiciously, to punish the wicked and benefit the good. In short, the Boogeyman is an extremely versatile type of villain that is born out of our cultural and folkloric fears of the things that could be lurking in the dark. Since they are creatures of the imagination, the rules they abide by are flexible, and the forms they take can be limitless. But generally, they will either be shadow monsters, fear eaters, or nightmare weavers, and can usually only be repelled by facing them head-on and overcoming those fears. Which is usually easier said than done and often leaves trails of bodies in its aftermath, but I digress. And with that, that brings us to the end of this installment of Evil-ution. Let me know in the comments if there's any other fearsome creatures of the night that I may have missed, and what types of villains you'd like me to look into next, whether it's any specific characters or a whole category of them. And remember, if you enjoyed this video, do all the YouTube things. Like, subscribe, ring the bell, and whatnot. It helps you to know when I post new videos, and helps me to know how often to keep these up. That's all for now. Once again, I'm Danger Dan Jers, and this has been Evil-ution. Thanks for watching.
What happened here?
Oh, nothing, Marge. Just a little incident involving the Boogeyman. Of course, none of this would have happened if you had been here to keep me from acting stupid.